Hello, 6110 students. I just wanted to record a short video for you to watch before class this week. This material was part of our slide deck for our first weekend on feedback, and I'm asking you to watch this before you come to class so that we can jump right into the role play with the 4 feedback case exercises. This will save us a little bit of time, get us right away into an interactive exercise, and then move right into the rest of our material for this week, which will be on decision making for the rest of the morning, and then power and influence and social networks for the afternoon. So when we think about feedback, I covered some of this rather quickly right at the end of class for us last weekend. But one of the things that makes feedback less effective is the receiver themselves. And there are some things specifically that it can affect whether or not the receiver of feedback will in fact hear what you're saying and be able to accept that information and act on that information to change their performance. The first is that there's a general sense that feedback feels inaccurate. Many times when someone gives us critical feedback, we feel like it doesn't really represent who we think we are. And part of that is that we have these so-called positive self-illusions or self-enhancement effects. And these are a sort of cognitive processing bias that we all have, and it keeps us psychologically healthy. But it becomes a little bit of a challenge when we need to learn and hear something that doesn't necessarily match with how we view ourselves. I mentioned that happened in the Google Oxygen case, where one of the managers was receiving some feedback after the Oxygen 8 implementation, and she felt she already did one of the Oxygen 8 pretty well, and she found out that in fact, sort of how she was doing it was not really resonating with her employees. A second reason why receivers may not actually hear or accept feedback is the so-called attribution bias. We'll get into this in more detail this week, but essentially what it means is that when we think of ourselves, if something's happened or we haven't performed to maybe the level we can, we tend to identify external causes. So not ourselves, not our own motivation, not our own ability, but we tend to look to reasons why we weren't supported or we weren't given enough time or the request was unreasonable, something outside of ourselves. We'll see that the givers of feedback suffer this bias in a different direction. And then finally, anytime someone is critical of us or giving us feedback that questions our performance, it's just natural that we end up feeling a bit defensive and emotional. And once we sort of turn on the emotional part of our brain, we tend not to be able to process things at the same level we can when emotions aren't involved. And we also sometimes get into an ego threat as well when people are telling us that we're not living up to some expectation they have for us. So these are all reasons why from the receiver side, it's hard for critical feedback to be effective. But then the givers themselves have problems. And as we learned in the article that we read about the Deloitte decision to change their performance evaluation system, unfortunately, a significant amount of the variance in performance evaluations or feedback interventions is due to the raters. Qualities of the people themselves. And some of that is just general personality or the way that people take things on. But another part of this is these so-called inference making limitations that were discussed in the actionable feedback article. So if we look at this from the standpoint of what this means and what they mean by the ladder of inferences are the way that we process information and try to understand cause and effect. And if we take a look at this ladder, so-called ladder of influence, what we see is that people have available to them a pool of information about another person. The problem is that at any given moment, we may not really be actively processing that much information. Sorry, I just lost my little pointer. We may not be actively processing as much of this information as we could. Maybe we're really only seeing, a portion of it. We're not really seeing behavior that someone's doing. And then at the same time, we tend to filter things. So we only select data, that we're noticing. And here's my little eyeball, right? My eyeball is looking at certain data, and it's not noticing other things in the blind spot. So as a result, we kind of select this data, and we only see certain things. So maybe we see an employee or one of our coworkers who comes into the office late every day, and we notice this because we're already working at our desk, and it's sort of noticeable when they roll in 2 or 3 hours after the rest of us. The rest of this process then means that we start to make assumptions about that selected data. Maybe we don't notice they stay longer than us. Maybe we don't notice that they, or even know that they have late night conference calls with Asia that they're on, and so therefore they've negotiated to come in a little bit later, or it just makes sense that they do. But we start to make assumptions about them, maybe in about how dedicated they are to their work, and we therefore draw some conclusions about them. We develop some beliefs about them, that maybe they're lazy or they're not the kind of employee we should have around here. And then we take some kind of action and we give feedback. Now, what should be apparent if we give feedback based on this kind of ladder of inference, that if we knew more data, maybe we wouldn't end up taking the action. Maybe our action was to comment on the person and say, must be nice coming in late every day, or some other kind of snobby, ineffective way to provide critical feedback to someone. And then the problem is we tend to reinforce these beliefs by continuing to just sample the same sort of information and continue making a loop of this process. So once we're done with this idea, here's where we kind of then make mistakes. So we're first of all maybe not acting on accurate information, and we're letting some of these narrow perceptions and biases lead to our feedback decision in the first place. So that's problem one. We need to kind of be comfortable that we actually have accurate data and are making the correct assumptions and beliefs before we take action. But then we also have the attribution biases that I talked about with problems with receivers, but givers have this flip side. When we look at others' performance, we tend to downplay the situation for them, and we tend to make judgment that the reason they're not behaving the way we want them to is a quality of their person. So they're not dedicated, they're not motivated, something that we attach to them, rather than maybe taking a little more effort to look at our own behavior. Are we interacting with them the way we need? Are we giving them the right guidance and goals? Are we supporting them well? We tend to ignore those external factors when we're looking at someone else. We also tend to feel overconfident that if we notice this, then you must be aware of it, and therefore you are consciously not actually doing what I think you should be doing. Sometimes when we look at a person, a third party might see that behavior very differently, which when we talk about decision making and making effective decisions this week, what we'll find is that having a so-called kind of sort of a counsel for yourself to bounce things off of isn't a bad idea. So particularly if you feel like you have to deliver some very difficult feedback, it probably is worth your while to check yourself and check your judgment with a few others who know the person in question before you actually go through delivering that feedback. And then of course we ourselves might engage in strong emotions, partly because sometimes we only engage in feedback when our emotions are already elevated. We're angry that someone hasn't done what we expected them to do. We're frustrated with what we see as repeated behavior. So there's a lot of reasons why our emotions might already be involved, in which case we're unlikely to deliver feedback in terms of content or the process of delivering feedback that will be effective. So you all read the actionable feedback article, so I won't spend a lot of energy here, but that article does a very good job of explaining that another reason that feedback interventions, or critical feedback in particular, doesn't work, and frankly this will apply to positive or recognition feedback as well, but when it's critical feedback, the problems are that we often tend to focus on the person and not the behavior and say, you do blah, 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 or you are blah, blah, blah. We often give vague assertions or blanket statements that something always happens or don't give a concrete situation or limited time that we saw the behavior in. So we need to think about a defined range of application so that people can accept that there was a specific incident that they can work on. And then we don't necessarily tell people why that's a problem and who it's impacting in which ways. So if we address those things, we will improve the quality of feedback. So I just alluded to positive feedback, and one thing that I would suggest is that we do far too little giving recognition or positive feedback. And we'll see in our discussion of influence tactics this week that this option of giving people positive feedback and reinforcement is one of the most powerful ways of increasing liking and reciprocity in terms of influencing others and getting people to do what you want them to do. It also taps into the sense of recognition and purpose that will, and maybe even meaningfulness, that will elevate intrinsic motivation and therefore encourage people to repeat the behaviors we want. So in this example, it's a kind of silly little example, but for example, if you were wanting to say that someone's participation in class or in your team meeting was really helpful, if you just said, I really appreciate it, you helped me a lot today. That is something that I kind of call the attaboy, right? It's a slap on the back and says, good job. The problem with that is that we may think we give people a lot of positive recognition, but these sort of blanket attaboy statements do little to reinforce behaviors we want, and they do little to really apply motivation through recognition in people. So instead, we need to say something more like, when I heard you speak up in class today, so a very specific situation, or in the meeting we had today, and you explained the net present value calculation, I suddenly understood this relationship I didn't get before, and now I'm able to complete my assignment, right? So it's much more concrete and shows people more specifically what you're really happy that they were doing. So whether it's positive recognition or we'll see with critical feedback coming up, we should always, when we're giving feedback, be direct. It should be to the person about the person. We should then identify the specific behavior. I'm really glad to my daughter that this morning you took out the recycling, right? So this morning in the recycling, and the impact was I didn't trip over the bag of recycling in the dark when I had to go to work this morning early. So again, what we don't want to do is talk about you are such a great person, but that action was something that was really helpful. So when we think about actionable feedback, and in particular when we start to get into critical feedback, this is where we need to take great care with the ladder of inference and ask ourselves, how do we arrive at the conclusion? Have we convinced ourselves that we haven't just engaged in some kind of biased data sampling? We should spend some time to think about maybe cataloging some specific instances and situations where we saw the behavior and where we feel confident we can describe that in a way the person will accept that that's what was happening in the situation. We should limit it only to those circumstances and try our hardest to not suggest this is always the way the person is or is behaving. And ultimately think about constructive ways to help them. And finally, check ourselves and really ask ourselves why we're trying to do this feedback, why we're trying to do this feedback now, and hold ourselves accountable to doing this only when we're really wanting to change behavior and improve performance, as opposed to, for example, get back at somebody or get some revenge or feel better about how angry or frustrated we've become, because those are other reasons why feedback interventions aren't very helpful. All right, rather quickly now, I just want to run through these slides that we will practice when we meet this weekend. And first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this feedback process so that we're all thinking about this the same way. The first building block of good quality feedback, particularly critical feedback, is to think through this process. And step one is that we have to formulate the feedback. And if we engage in spontaneous feedback, we're probably not spending enough time doing this to carefully think through these elements here, right? What is our goal? What do we want to have happen? If it's just to burn off some of our anger, well, don't expect a whole lot in return, and maybe expect that you're going to burn some bridges or create some ill will that might be difficult to overcome. then we should at least check our gut about our fears. What are we worried about by giving feedback? Are we worried the person will be angry? Are we worried we won't get the results we want? What are we thinking we're going to be worried about? Because at least then we're prepared maybe for a range of different reactions. Make sure we've thought through what those specific behaviors we observed are and the impact, which we talked about in the previous slide. Okay, now we've formulated it. It's actually a very good idea to try to write it out and see if it passes the test of actionable feedback. Once we've done that, we really should rehearse this. Ideally, if not just in a mirror out loud, but even maybe finding a trusted colleague or a partner or spouse and going through the scenario and saying, can I just practice this? Can I try it out on you to see what you think the person might hear from me? And then it's also important to at least think about what the reactions could be. What if the person's just stone-faced silent? What are you going to do? What if the person starts to cry or yells at you? What are you going to do? So that you can manage your emotions ahead of time by thinking about some of those scenarios that could happen. And then and only then should we deliver the feedback to the person. And we need to think about the right place and time, giving the person some privacy, making sure there's not some kind of rush happening. The setting and situation matter as well. So now, this is where we've delivered the feedback. But once we're done with that, we also want to spend a little time to kind of ask to hear if they've really heard what we had to say. So maybe asking them if they have any questions or if they could repeat any of it, or if there's something that's unclear about what we said. And maybe if you feel like they're hearing you and their emotional state is sort of in the right place, you could start asking some questions about why this is happening. Because again, remember, it's too easy for us to make an attribution that it's something that they're doing or they're choosing to do, when maybe there's something that's in the way that you can clear the way and help them change this behavior very quickly. And then finally, part of this process with inquiry and part of the process in terms of evaluating their reactions is to consider whether or not the time is right at the feedback intervention to do some coaching, or if it would be better to let the person go, give it a little thought, maybe ask them to think about what might be causing the behavior that you might be able to help them with, and then set up another time to consider the coaching process. All right, so quickly, being good at giving feedback effectively, especially critical feedback, requires that we're really good at observation and that we use some careful tools to collect evidence, so we're not sampling in that ladder of inference inappropriately. We need to be analytical to try to understand what we can as best we can about cause and effect, so we don't just make simple attribution errors. We need to have some interpersonal warmth and emotional regulation skills so that we can deliver feedback calmly and not react in a negative way if somebody does have an emotional reaction, which includes the idea of self-management as well. So kind of quickly to summarize, if we're thinking about the essential content of feedback, we want concrete behavior, and we want to talk about the impact the behavior has on whom. Those are sort of the building blocks of actionable feedback. So, you never listen to me. This violates the problem about where we've got the never, right? This is too blanket. And you, right? And maybe we're talking about listening, which is a behavior, but not very good. Here, if we'd say at our meeting with the marketing reps, right now we're in a very specific situation. Now the behavior is you provided them deadlines that were wrong. And here's where the impact came, right? That you tell them, I gave you those deadlines and I'm not sure why you gave them different ones. That made me feel like you didn't listen to me, right? So again, we can pick this apart, but we want to get those basic elements in there. All right, next building block, you need to know why you're doing this. You need to understand why you're giving feedback and why you're doing it now. You want to think about, is the quality of the feedback where it needs to be? Is the person ready to hear something? We need to talk about how do you think about when the person might be most receptive. We need to think about whether or not, and hopefully you are thinking about wanting to make the relationship maintained and long. and the ongoing learning opportunities that your employee or peer or superior has as a result. And then think through your own fears, right, so that you're ready to be a credible source for this person and a supportive coach to help them improve their outcomes in the long run. The fourth building block is about this inquiry question, right, which is after we've delivered the feedback, we want to be thinking about asking them if they understood it. Can you give your perspective because maybe they saw it differently and they can explain something that helps you understand it? And then looking or searching for the causes of behavior, why it might have happened. It's very good to go to inquiry because it makes you be listening and in learning, and it shows them that you respect them enough to hear their side. It makes sure that you've actually understood and that in fact they've heard what you had to say, because if they start talking about things that are very different than what you intended, you can act to clarify. And it will also help you understand, again, at that point, if you think they're ready now to talk at this point about coaching, about what can change, how to support altering this behavior going forward. And then finally, if you do or when you do decide that the time is right to do the coaching, it's important to remember that you're not telling the person what to do differently. And this ties back into our conversations about motivation because it violates the idea of autonomy, and you want people to kind of come to their conclusions or at least collaborate with you to come to the conclusions about how to move their behavior forward. You don't want to interrupt their own learning process by just telling them how to change their behavior. So we want to show them that you're going to give them psychological support, that you care about them, that the reason you were doing this intervention in the first place is that you want them to develop and you want them to perform better, and you don't want this situation to create problems for them elsewhere in their career. And then if you can give them instrumental guidance, if there's certain resources or other direct help that they would like, they can ask you for that, and you can make it clear that you will offer that. So that was a really quick tour through this feedback material. I'm glad you listened to this because in doing so we'll be more prepared to jump right in and have you formulate some feedback. And in fact, if you haven't done that already, I would try to use that general formula from Actionable Feedback to identify specific feedback, prepare specific feedback for each of the 4 cases. And when we start class this weekend, we'll use those as role plays and test this out and have a chance for you to talk to your classmates about tips that they've experienced in both giving and receiving feedback and making that more effective. We'll see you this weekend. Thanks.